Hello, hello, hello. So we're going to start again? Yes. Can everybody move up a little bit? Otherwise, it's so strange with these empty chairs here in front. Yeah. Michael, would you mind just taking these folding chairs out here at the back? Would you mind just? So we're at the last um, part of this conference, and um, yeah, I mean, the central theme that is left is the theme of freedom, which we would like to spend the remaining time on, if possible. Now, there are various of you who will say something about freedom, and I'm going to invite also Rabindra also specifically to say something. And the format will be, first I give the panel members, the speakers, a chance to respond to that question if they choose to respond to that, and then we open it up, and then we can all contribute and have an exchange and ask questions to the speakers, or just share your own understanding of how you see this question of freedom, and maybe in a new light after we have seen or discussed everything we have discussed so far in the conference. Now there's and the question of freedom has many components. So I want to bring some out, and then I want to give the word to Rabindra also to bring some of these elements out. Like, I think Thomas also was talking about it, that like enlightenment or spirituality is the highest form of being self-concerned, or concerned with yourself or something like that. But and that's indeed, I think, one of the big problems, that it's like the biggest ice cream we can have, right? Freedom, the enlightenment. And so from that, it's really that's a huge challenge that we're having. So how can we look at this question of freedom without um, um, romantic religious connotations, without or at least to be very aware of it, that we're coming from that place. And I'm not dismissing religions with that, right, or religious tests, but I'm just saying if there's a romantic notion on it, like a desire to become something else than what we are, then I feel that we're not doing ourselves a service in the sense of being rigorous. The other question also is I feel that we somehow need to answer is the question is of why do we put the question of freedom there at all? What is the relevance of that question? And some of us might say, and Krishnamurti might say, well, and the Buddha, of course, said that it's directly related to human suffering, that there's a relationship between freedom and human suffering, that for some reason the self, freedom from self, or freedom of self, or freedom without the word from or of in between, is related to a minimization of suffering, or an absence of suffering. But then also in talking with many of you also in these last few days, that the word suffering has so many different meanings, because suffering can be meaning, what is it? We're going to the hospital and that is suffering, and of course that's also suffering in a way. So we're talking here also we have another issue of word mapping, that how Krishnamurti talked in a specific sense about suffering might not always be the general acceptance way of talking about suffering. And we haven't actually gone into more specifying how Krishnamurti used the word suffering. I mean, in summarization, I will ask Hilary also to say a little bit more later on, is that Krishnamurti said that suffering is related to becoming, and always wanting to become something else than what we are. So that is a psychological suffering, and it's a particular subset of suffering. So the self, freedom, suffering, these three are related. Now, how are they related? And I would like if we can throw a light on that. And can we also ask the question, why is this question relevant? Is it the question relevant because we want to escape from something? Is it the fact of it that we're discontented with our lives and would like to find a way out? is that all at the core, or is the question more coming from an interest to understand our lives as it is, understand how we are made up, what kind of animal we are, and that in equal sense we're just curious and investigating in this question. So there's no motivation to get rid of anything or to suppress anything. So, okay, so that's my 2 cents, and now I'm going to ask Rabindra to elaborate on this, or to add to this.
He's only asking me because we talked about this at lunch, but I think you unpacked it all already. I mean, I think the only thing I can add is that I asked why freedom and self were put in the same question. So why don't we look at freedom independent of freedom from the self? In light of what we've been talking about the last few days, it almost seems like a silly question, because the self, as it's been described, is so ingrained in every action and everything we're doing and in all our biology and all that. It seems absurd to ask the question, freedom from something on which our whole life is so dependent. So I thought first to unpack what we mean by freedom, why we even ask that question. Are we feeling unfree? That has to be clear, because I think most of us don't really feel unfree. So yet we ask the question, and then it becomes very theoretical. So I just wanted to get clear what is meant by freedom. So I would ask that question first. What do we mean by freedom? So that's all I can add other than what you said. I mean, it's related to self and suffering and all the rest of it, but what exactly do we mean? If I say I want to be free, what do I mean?
If you want to be free, you want a bigger ice cream. I think that's what it is. So there's a microphone here. So maybe one of you wants to start, and then. No. I hope actually maybe Hillary can say something to start with, if willing. Yeah.
Is that working now? Yep. So, so in the Hindu tradition, dharma, righteousness, kama, pleasure, love, artha, achievement, money, accomplishment, and so on. But then moksha is the highest of these 4 worthwhile goals to pursue in life. And it's not that terribly different from the notion of nirvana and Buddhism. So the notion of pursuing freedom is found in these Eastern traditions as the highest pursuit for a human being to go after. One may not always think that it's a worthwhile goal to pursue, because one's often trying to pursue righteousness or pleasure or money or wealth and so on. But at some point, they often say, some point in your life you begin to realize that you are in a state of bondage. So the notion of freedom arises in relationship to the idea that one is fundamentally bound. Now, in these Eastern traditions, the thing that binds you is the inexorable principle or law of karma. Karma is a moral principle of causality, in which you find that all of your actions, every thought, every feeling, everything that arises in you is a kind of a mechanical response to circumstance, to previous actions, the world around you. And one finds oneself like an automaton, like a robot stuck in this thing, a victim to one's previous actions, one's previous thoughts, memories, and so on and so forth. So liberation is a sense of freedom from that. Now, they understand freedom in a bunch of other ways as well, but the long and the short of it is that this notion of freedom is something we come upon when we realize, we come to the sense that we are in bondage. And then it becomes a passionate thirst because we realize no matter what we seem to do, we're bound. So how does one gain liberation? So now I can flip to Krishnamurti. So because quite often people come to Krishnamurti's teachings and ideas, well, they sometimes will read and, I didn't know I was bound, and oh yeah, look, I am. I'm kind of conflicted. My thoughts move in these neurotic ways over and over again, whatever it is. Or there's the sense of, I want liberation, and maybe this guy's teachings will help me to gain liberation. And so they'd often approach Krishnamurti, or you hear from questions that would come to him, how do I gain liberation? And then Krishnamurti would say, sorry, sir, how is the wrong question? What? Because you're asking for a path, a means, a method. You want me to tell you how to gain liberation. And the moment I do that, you're accepting me as an authority, or I'm laying out a pathway for you to follow that you're then going to follow. And truth is a pathless land. Unfortunately, the moment you step on something, trying to get somewhere, you're already moved away from where it is. So my understanding of Krishnamurti is that freedom is an intrinsically given state. And perhaps then that mirrors what Rabindra was saying, that we feel free, generally, because perhaps we are fundamentally free. But the moment we stop to reflect on whether we are free or not, we've created a self, and that very created self is bound, because to know the self is to work with the known is bondage. It's a little. It feels odd to say these because they sound just like words, but there's a certain essential freedom that is ever present. But to some extent, the moment thought moves, there's a movement of bondage, if you like, right? Not if thought is understood, because I think then the movement is not a movement in bondage. So the idea of bondage and freedom fall apart if there's a quality of seeing. But when there isn't seeing, the movement of thought can become problematic. The self ends up binding itself with the idea of bondage and freedom because its essential being is contracted. Thought has contracted the world and the self. And out of that contraction, there's a sense of limitation. And so there's this fundamental sense of, oh my gosh, now I am in bondage because I've identified with this thought-constructed reality and self, and now I need to be free. What do I do to get free? Oh, Krishnamurti says I can't do anything, so I shouldn't be doing anything. Now, so I shouldn't be doing anything, but I'm doing something. How do I not do something? And you're off away into a world. This is for the Krishnamurti folk. For others, it's easy, go and meditate and be mindful and sit here and do this, that, and the other. They have a given path through which they can reach liberation, they hope. But for the Krishnamurti, people who are impressed with what Krishnamurti has to say, they have a different kind of an angst. It's the angst of not doing to be free. That is somewhat problematic and painful, right? But in both cases, thought is moving in some respects, and thought is always moving us away out of the state of bondage, out of the state of fundamental freedom into bondage. When that is seen, if that is seen, that just happens. That's what occurs. That's part of the mechanical functioning of a conditioned being, which to some extent we sort of are. So, but there is a fundamental freedom from that conditioning, even though the embodied self is a conditioned entity.
I'm probably going to say something similar, so let's have another. Oh, so you want? No, I don't know. This is difficult for me in terms of trying to unpack what freedom means. I was just having a short conversation with Terry, and one thing that has seemed plausible as something that could happen for all of us within us is the realization, whether that's an insight that comes from within or whether it comes about because of ideas floating around in the broader culture, that this entity we take ourselves to be, each one of us, is not as solid as it appears from within, and is not as immutable as it appears from within. So that knowledge, if it allows for, if it allows for some way of looking at the self as not being an entity but a process, and that to me would be the beginnings of what Hillary is talking about. But beyond that, I'm kind of reluctant to say, from my own personal perspective. It's just, for me, it's just that being able to break out what Thomas was talking about this morning, when he was saying that most of the time, say you're sitting down to meditate, and if your mind wanders away, then it's caught in that movement of whatever it is that those series of thoughts are. And then occasionally sort of the knowing self or the epistemic self comes back and says, oh, I should come back and watch my breath. So in a way, that to me is, if we can get to that point where we're able to see this process, making the epistemic self be a little bit more active. How we do that, I don't know. Each one to ourselves, I don't know. But that could be the beginnings of breaking through the sense of a monolithic, immutable self.
So in sort of asking the question, can an entity be free, or you could use any other word, might imply that it can be in state A or B, and A is not free and B is free, but the entity is still the entity, and these are two states it's in, just as I could be sitting in a warm room or a cold room, but I'm still there. But supposing, just suppose that something is the property, it's not the state that an entity is in, but it's the very fundamental property of that entity, or one of its properties. It's like if this is a chair and it's made of wood, and wood's made of carbon, and if the chair says, oh, what would it be like if I didn't have any carbon? To me, it's a question like that. How would it be a chair? How would it be a piece of wood without carbon? How can that be asked? It would be something else. It could be a piece of metal, but wood can't say, what would my state be, assuming it's still wood, without carbon in it? Be free of carbon. That's the issue. It's not, because if it was possible that it's in state A or B, one can ask the question, but can't ask the question if that is what defines that entity, is an inseparable component of that entity. And so as we're talking here over these past few days, and if there are these things that define what it is to be a human or a primate or something, how can one ask the question? It's not different for me than the question of what would it have been like 20 years ago if, instead of going on this path and doing what I did, if I'd chosen, or another path had chosen me, something like that. Where would I be today? Or instead of marrying the person I did, if I hadn't gotten married or if I'd been married to someone else, where might I be? Just for the fun of it, let's speculate. And to me, the answer is crystal clear. And the answer is that, well, that wouldn't be me today. There would be someone who looks like me and sounds like me. But that wouldn't be me. You can't ask a question, where would I be? Because I am, whom I married is part of what I am today. So the question is not, how can I separate me from my history and what I did? And so that's a false question. It can't have an answer. Or if you insist on an answer, my answer is very simple, that it would be someone who just looks a lot like me and sounds a lot like me, but in a sense wouldn't be me. I don't know what else to.
You're still not you. Can I say a couple words? I think maybe instead of trying to ask what freedom is, because I'm not sure any of us really know what that means, it might be possible to relate to the other sort of side of it, where we actually feel not free. And I think that a lot of people would be familiar with. Like if you're deeply sad or getting close to depression, when you're aware of a cycle of thoughts that you can't break out of, I think that, neurosis of a kind, whether it comes to us because of some events that happened or organically, that in order to break out of that requires that little sliver of seeing that tells you that these are just thoughts. And so I think it's easier to understand what it might mean to be enslaved by thoughts when they actually get to the point of going towards depression or deep sadness. And then figuring out how to break out of that is part of the process of being free. And then it makes sense to say, what are we getting free from, right? But this other idea of being totally free, I'm not sure I understand what that means.
Let me just pick that up. So we've discussed the scientific perspective a bit, and I've already said what the scientific perspective would be. There are determined systems. They have degrees of autonomy. Optimal self-control, suboptimal self-control. The suffering from depressive rumination would exactly be a case where mental autonomy is low because the focus of attention is not under control anymore, because the content of thoughts cannot be controlled. So from a sober evidence-based perspective, there can just be degrees of autonomy, plus we are mortal embodied beings. There are probably forms of suffering which are ultimately completely beyond our control. And now I was thinking, is it actually unethical to publish a book with a title like Total Freedom? Because you've already mentioned it. In my view, I have been out of this K community for 3 decades now, because I thought that was very dangerous and absurd to still meet after his death. And now I'm meeting people again in Germany, and I think he's just left after his death. Many people, for the rest of their life, try to understand what he actually meant, and don't get out of these circles anymore. They know meditation is wrong because it is methodological and an effort. So they are in the situation that has just been described, and that's his heritage. And of course, maybe these people were also traumatized by a book title like Total Freedom, because once you've heard it, and of course you didn't ever accept any authority, but somehow you were impressed by the man, he was probably talking about something. There's a part of you that believes that total, absolute freedom must be possible, else there wouldn't be a book title like that. So was it ethical? To put an idea like that into people's head and then all leave them behind. Maybe, I don't know if that's true, but maybe something like total freedom is just not possible for embodied biological mortal beings. Maybe there are just degrees, you know. I don't know if you ever read any Dutch philosophy, but Spinoza said freedom is insight into necessity. So to just have an insight into the determined workings of it all, that's what liberates, right? And I mean, if we take a scientific or evidence-based perspective, this can only come in degrees. But I think all of us, probably all of us in this room, have been poisoned by a certain meme, you know, and that's the meme of total freedom. And I'm poisoned by this too. You know, I have my secret stories about how it might still be possible. You know, and maybe all of you have a secret idea about how it could be possible too. And here we are. So, I mean, just to be a bit provocative, one question is, if it is ethical to infect other people with that meme of total freedom, and then leave them alone in this world, you know. Mm-hmm. Right. Enormously impressed me, but if you imagine somebody who doesn't want to be an authority to make a public self-description like that, you know.
As an editor who actually has chosen several titles. Fortunately, not that. Because the attempt usually has been to give a title which somehow he has said. Now, I don't know whether in that case somebody had found a passage in which total freedom came up repeatedly. But I take your point, actually, that there is a real sense of responsibility about presenting Krishnamurti's books in a manner which is too promising.
Mm-hmm.
Because, in fact, he's, I think, a very challenging philosopher, for that, to apply. I'd like to add a bit more about freedom.
Do you want to take the microphone?
Perhaps, slightly jet-lagged version. But it's clear that freedom for Krishnamurti is seen as psychological freedom. He had toothache and leg cramps, and he made it clear that we're not going to avoid suffering in the physical form. Now, what he meant by freedom, he has talked about freedom in various ways, and I think I can give one version, which is late Krishnamurti perhaps, where he says that freedom is when the brain ceases to have images, I sometimes call those mental constructs personally, which are put together by thought based on limited memory, knowledge, and experience. That incidentally leaves space for thinking in his view of thinking, which is of a practical kind and the kind of thinking in science and technology. Now, I tried to summarize that for myself by saying, can you then say psychological freedom is freedom from misapplied thought? And I think in order to venture that one, you have to go very carefully into the whole question of what he means by limitations of thinking. And perhaps it's of some interest to say that he himself came to a conviction about the limitations of thinking when his brother died, as though that was an experience which left him with a total conviction that thinking couldn't handle that experience. So the whole place of thinking is intimately connected, I think, in Krishnamurti with the notion of freedom.
Yeah, I want to take that point of view and then work on this. Oh, sorry. And work on this question of freedom and see if we can get the question out properly and clarity, which is this. What David was saying was about the thought process moving and conditioning us and all that. So I see that as a basic fact. My background is always reacting to the situations in which I am, whatever the situation it be. And it's so persistent that I'm unable to look at anything without those reactions. The mind is not responsive, it is reactive at this point. And so, but I've never stopped to consider what is the meaning of response? What is the meaning of meeting somebody, looking at something and all that, because I'm so much in a hurry to react, and these reactions are very deep. So that is one important fact I think one has to take into account. Now, the other thing that I want to say in relation to freedom is that I'm always thinking of myself as a separate part. And when I'm a separate part, in what sense can I be free? Because I'm a part, I'm pushed by other parts. The political system is pushing me, the economic system is pushing me, in religious system is pushing me. I'm pushed from all directions. So the question of freedom begins to disappear from my view. There is not even clarity about the importance of freedom. It becomes a reaction, it becomes a state of mind. I want to be free of all the encumbrances of my mind, which otherwise I'm very busy with. So that becomes a problem. So I want to ask the question, what is the relationship of freedom to the whole? I mean, what is the relevance of the whole to the question of freedom? I'm not sure where it will take us, but I thought I will ask that question, because most of the time we are thinking in separate parts, fragments, as Bohm puts it. I think David was also alluding to that. So that's the question I want to ask.
I do have something to add. Good now? Okay. So I'm going to try to bring in a couple of things that have been said just recently, and then to come back to your question. So I think Patik, if I understood it, might have indicated that that freedom is a quality. It's not somewhere out there, but it might be a quality inherent in things. Then Thomas, you mentioned the insight into necessity. And I think the one bit I will want to bring in here is the insight into necessity and contingency might have something to do with freedom. And then to go back to the initial question of how do we know we're not free? So suddenly when we were there, I was thinking about being inside a cell. I'm locked inside a cell. And so I can't get out. I can't go for a nice walk. I've worked with young offenders, so I know this feeling of being inside and you're not allowed to go out for a walk and to see the sky. And it's not a very pleasant feeling. But so I kind of thought, when we're not free, because maybe this is our experience that we're not free, there's an issue of relationship to what is outside the boundaries that is enclosing us. So there's a problem of relationship, that somehow we're not in relationship. We can't do as we please. But it's this essence of no relationship, which to me means lack of freedom. So this already, I think, points towards the question of wholeness. But the next thing that I think perhaps is crucial to consider is that I'm inside this cell and I'm trying to get out, and I keep running against the wall because I'm thinking maybe it's going to be a matter of force. If only I just crash into it hard enough, I'll be out of here. That doesn't work, and I get the immediate feedback of pain because I haven't managed to cross that boundary. So suffering is perhaps that. It's an attempt of trying to get out from some confines, and when I can't do that, I'm hurting. If I keep doing this mechanically and I keep trying to do it the same way, I won't be able to do it. So then I thought, what hasn't really been mentioned yet, which I think is crucial to consider in terms of freedom, is creativity. Can I find a creative way out of the prison? Can I start looking at options and consider the necessities and the contingencies? There's the story about it. This if you're on drugs, different types of drugs will make you try to tackle the situation a different way. Apparently, if you're on LSD, you will try to go through the keyhole, thinking that this is absolutely possible. But of course, you bump into that, it hurts. So, to come then to the point is, I think there's an issue of relationship in which is implicit wholeness, because you want to be related to what is outside the boundary. And in fact, we also know that even if we consider a cell, it has to have a relationship with what is outside the boundary for it to be able to feed itself, for it to be able to exist. So that this has to be an open system, right? Whatever we're enclosed in, whatever we say is a limitation, and that's the word I haven't yet mentioned. I think lack of freedom is limitation, and lack of limitation is freedom. But I don't mean it in a chaotic sense, but even there would have to be necessity and contingency at play. And if I think of free jazz, which would then be a creative act, which has got a beauty and an order and a flow and a harmony, that mindset that is producing that music could be said to be free in a way that for that time being, within the confines of necessities and contingencies of staying with an instrument, there is a creative movement in which I think there is something rather invigorating, and as a result of which something, I hesitate to say, new happens, new comes into being. So it's not just a repetition of limitation, but there's an element of new which is inherently connected to something beyond itself, if that makes any sense. So.
I wonder if we're honest in a sense of our description of our relationship to thought, because I think there's a tendency to maybe focus on that which we don't want and not see to the degree that we're enamored by that which we say we don't want. And so they seem to be two sides of the same coin. So it's like trying to take one foot and kick the other foot off of the body or something. So, and I wonder if the thing that wants to get rid of and the thing that wants to keep, which we are calling the self, is actually understood. Before we even speak of freedom, do we understand what we're trying to be free from? And then how does that question, how honest are we in that inquiry, in the sense of maybe it's a borrowed question, maybe it's something I think I should be free, and I take up the mantle of I'm going to be free. And so I'm wondering how clear we are in our quest for freedom, and what that was the initial question, is what do we actually mean by we want to be free, and where are we looking for that freedom, and is actually the quest for freedom the final obstacle to moksha, because you believe that there's something you can be I don't know. So there's a lot maybe that's not tidy in these questions, but often I hear in our language it's like we're really clear on the thing that we don't want, but it's not so intimate, the relationship we have to that which is also part of the conditions. So I don't know. No.
I'm just going to add another point. In light of what has been discussed in the last couple of days, there seems to be a kind of path, an evolutionary path that is unfolding, that creates our bodily movements and our mental movements and so on. So when we talk about freedom, it doesn't seem that there's any particular action you could take to ever control that or do anything about that. So then, if everything I do is more of me, then it makes sense that perhaps there's some kind of freedom in simply not resisting that movement that has been described, either as evolution or all the things you talked about. So if there's a possibility of a state that is completely non-resistant, without trying to do anything about, I have to be free from self or this or that, because any such movement creates more of itself. So if there's anything like freedom, if there's any creative act, it has to be in non-resistance. It's nowhere else. There's no other action you can take. So it's not so much that you have an idea of what freedom is, but there's a certain action now. Now, the action itself is already creative because it's probably very new not to resist, or there's always something in that. It is either that wandering mind, or then there's the mind that then suddenly takes ownership of something, which means it's again involved. So it seems to me that the first step anyway, without imagining all kinds of things about freedom, but simply because there's such a deep interest to understand, has to be, is motivated the right word? It has to be infused with complete non-resistance. That's one point. And the next point is that, just to get back to Krishnamurti, that often he associated the word freedom and responsibility in the same sentence. So, and I think he described it as responsiveness. In a state of freedom, there's an ability to respond, suggesting that the self is out of the way, that the cognitive bias is out of the way. So that was another way that he sort of suggested the importance of freedom, that that's a possibility, but that might be carrot dangling too. So, but I just wanted to bring that in, that those two words he often used together.
Yeah, I'd like to wind it back, if I may, to the beginning. I feel that freedom is a very deep urge in people, perhaps the deepest. For a start, people who are living in very extreme circumstances, destitute, or their sole endeavor is to get out of that situation. So their freedom consists in breaking out of some intolerable situation. That's a very, very basic level of it. But then as we proceed, we see that you might want to get rid of parental constraint, or you might want to get rid of some moral code, and that is another level of it. But it seems that this intrinsic nature of freedom remains, because even when we have gotten rid of all the constraints and we live in a beautiful place like this, and perhaps for the time being it's relatively free of conflict, there is still some sense that I am trapped here. My thoughts are swimming around. I have more or less no control over them. They're coming and going. I may be able to establish some momentary peace for a while, but this thing is going on, so I'm not free. These things, they are running me, I'm not running them. So I think this intrinsic nature of freedom remains, and it seems also, Kay talks about it and others talk about it, there's freedom from something, including the psychological plague. There's freedom from, and then there's also freedom in itself, which might be more like a flower that blooms. It's not blooming in opposition to anything. It's not blooming, well, it's blooming because of things, but it's not actually in opposition to anything at all. As Rabindra is saying, it's not in resistance to anything. It just grows out of itself. And that's a kind of freedom, I think, that would be, be worth our while to investigate. because it's not in opposition to anything. It does not create duality, but in some sense it's intrinsic. And as Hilary has suggested, it may actually be there, but one is not living it, or one is forgetting it, or it's impermanent.
I thought it was interesting, the point of knowing or having some idea of what freedom might be by thinking about what makes us feel like we're not free. I know for me personally, my experience has been that I tend to feel not free to express myself due to various constraints or people's reaction, not free to move in a way that feels comfortable and relaxed to me. I don't know if anyone noticed that I have weird movements that happen to my body all the time, and I can stop them, but I'm more relaxed if I don't. So it makes me feel free to be able to do them. So I appreciate everyone here for not stopping me. And that's been a huge theme in my life, is I always feel that I'm trapped or not free. I think mostly because I feel like I'll have these urges or impulses to do things, and even when I distill the wisdom underneath them, you know, like if I'm angry or whatever, then I say, well, why am I angry? What's really going on? What's the need that I have underlying this? And then even still can't meet that need without without getting to that point of being angry. And I think it's not being able to meet basic needs that ultimately makes me feel not free, whether they're needs for love or compassion or self-actualization, those kind of things that are maybe considered higher needs than just, you know, food and water and shelter. But I think it's ultimately related to not being able to meet my needs.
I'm thinking about Krishnamurti's idea of the negative approach. Also, some of the non-dualists suggest that the only thing we can do is to see the false as the false and then drop it. So the negative approach would be not this, thereby bringing you back to the creative moment, empty. And maybe that in itself is a function of thought.
It seems to me that one of the key points of Kay's teaching is the ending of the self. So we heard a lot during this conference about what is the self. So I wonder if we can really speak about freedom or compassion or whatever without ending the self. Because Kay says very clearly, without ending of the self, there is no freedom, there is no compassion, there is no love, etc. So did we really, or what can you say who inquired into the self during the weekend, did the self really end? Or what is it if it ends? I think that's much more important than the question of what is freedom, because it's related. Otherwise we define freedom as philosophers do, like Spinoza and others, but psychological freedom seems to me something totally different, but we can only talk about it if we look into the question, can the self end? Has it ended? Otherwise it's just speculation.
So in sort of trying to turn the a question around. I wonder if we can even appreciate the the quote unquote beauty or the quote unquote intelligence of the way things seem to have been set up or are unfolding, which is supposing I wanted to devise a system in which I wanted the entities, the organisms, to always look to change. One of the things I do is make sure they're not satisfied, because the moment they're satisfied, where's the urge going to come from to be different or get somewhere different? If I wanted to set up things about, well, it's okay if they're satisfied about A, B, C, but not D, E, F, then I have to make a complex system, and then A, B, C, and D, E, F, those contexts might be different today than they are tomorrow or in another part of the world. So instead of putting A, B, C, D, E, F, if I do something even more basic, which is just leave them unhappy, not unhappy about something, but just unhappy, just this feeling of being trapped, then you set up a system that's forever looking to be different, and what it will be different about will be dependent on what at that time it feels constrained by. So you set up a fantastic system that is enormously responsive to conditions, and that is sensing, you know, which condition is it that's bothering me, so it's going to work on that, something else will work on some other condition. And number three, and this is the kicker, if you set it up such that it can never be satisfied, because you set an impossible, you set up as an impossibility, an absolute impossibility, the attainment of that. Yes, something like that. then you've made a perpetual motion machine, which will go till whatever that end is that we don't know and we don't need to define. So you set up with just 3 priors something fantastic, and of course we're going to be saying suffering, 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 because that, but the beauty of that is that's what creates the movement, that's what looks for solutions, that's what maximizes the creativity, that's what imposes the least constraints on, oh, look this way and not that way, or try this and not that. Everything's open. If I'm just inherently unhappy and can never, ever, ever, ever be happy, and if I'm not told what to be unhappy about or happy about. So it's actually clinically, like, you don't want to suffer, and I don't want people I care about to suffer, but I can't help marveling at what a brilliant setup this is for what it does with such few concerns. This is fantastic. Oh.
I just like that analogy. So if just following that analogy of this perpetual motion machine, the way you described it, it's it must have features in it that make it continue, and one of them is this impossible goals are set up, keep the thing moving, trying to reach them. But if you learned about that machine and you were able to find out where to pull the plug, you could break the whole system, the system as a whole. But you'd have to find that out. And if something in that machine says every time you try to look for the plug it moves, or something like that, you'd never be able to find the plug. So it makes sense then to be like a cat. And pardon? No, you may not want to, but you saw the story. Yeah. Yeah, you probably will keep, you probably just keep looking for the plug. But you do that and you do that until you get frustrated. And then you decided to just watch it now, because you realize you're not learning. So now you're just going to watch it. Now if it turns out that that action that of watching suddenly doesn't fit anywhere, in and of itself it's disrupting the machine. You discover that something drops out of that you didn't intend. That something might be that the machine can no longer function in the way it's been functioning. It can no longer manufacture that self or do whatever. It doesn't mean it won't function, but something will change. So it could be that you simply have to find the right action, and maybe that's the clue that Krishnamurti has given, and other people too, about exactly what attention is all about, or choiceless awareness, or whatever he calls it. That there's a capacity in us, a capacity of perception, a capacity of other things, but also another capacity to watch without any movement whatsoever. Because this whole machine is depending on a kind of organized movement, organized by all kinds of principles we're learning about. So I do feel that there is some revolutionary action that's possible within that machine that can liberate us, and the more we learn about its mechanisms, as we've been learning, the more likely we will reach that insight into what that action could be.
Well, no, I just wanted to say, sort of tongue-in-cheek, that Patik, your design sounds rather intelligent. I kind of thought, it's a very intelligent design to put together a machine that's got all these features in it which will enable to do what they want to do. I a little bit would like to come back to just 2 points quickly, what the lady said here about movement and freedom, and also what Steve was discussing. And I want to also bring in the word with limitation, dependency. If something depends on something, it's not free. If I depend on air, I'm not free from air. I need air to exist, right? So this machine would be dependent on certain parameters or built-in features that would enable it to run, right? So it would be dependent. So in that sense, I would argue it's not free. Also, if, and I'm going to go back into sort of cosmology, and maybe Hilary will come in at some point on this and give us all the other different views on this. There is this idea of there being the unmoved mover, which is the ground of everything, right? Which itself is not dependent on anything and is free. It's got no limitations. So these are all ideas that have been around for a long time. And then we see that everything else, every other movement that we know is limited, is dependent on something, right? And it becomes then this question of, is there something that is completely not dependent on anything else? Would it be a thing? So it becomes a question of the limited and the unlimited. And I won't walk you through it, but there's a logical explanation, and I think we do need to respect logic, whereby you can decide that, are you going to start with saying that everything is limited, and where do you get with it? Or do you start with the notion that there is the unlimited, and the limited is somehow part of that? And if you start out with the assumption, in terms of logic, that everything is limited, then you will eventually cancel yourself out. You can't sustain that argument, because if everything is limited, your argument itself is going to be limited, and then it's no good. So it's a logical problem that is out there. So this is a modern day intimation, perhaps, of this very, very old idea that there is the unlimited, the infinite, which itself is not dependent on anything. In that sense, it would be free. This is the whole, the totality, and all of that. And everything else limited arises within that. Everything else is dependent on that, but that is not dependent on anything else. Now the gentleman was asking about the, and then I finished, the self. And if I'm dependent on the rainbow being up in the sky for anything, for my happiness, for my habitual way of life, I don't even know what it is, I'm going to be dependent on that rainbow being there. And without it, I'll be in trouble, and I will want to stick the rainbow back up there. I need to have the self there, because without it, nothing makes any sense. But if I don't particularly care about whether the rainbow is there or not, my days are not dependent on it. I just carry on doing what I'm doing. So I wanted to just return to that self or no self, experience or no experience, limitation or no limitation. if I'm not dependent of it, if I'm not resisting the movement, whatever it brings up and throws up and projects, I'm not dependent on it. And the words are difficult, but anyway, I think
I wanted to try to connect a point Uli Brugger has met, who's just left the room, and what you said. I don't know your name about freedom as something that's not opposed. So, according to the silly theory I sketched yesterday, the sense of selfhood ends in exactly the moment that the self model is not transparent anymore, but opaque, which means that it is experienced as a representation. So there's a very clear empirical prediction in that theory. The phenomenology of identification will end in the moment in which that self-model becomes opaque. Now, how could it be seen? What would be the entity that sees it as the content of a representation? Couldn't be you. So the idea I wanted to test out with you, if what you just said about freedom as something that is not opposed to anything, like a process. If intuitively I understand very well what you said, I think, but then it would mean this has nothing to do with yourself. And maybe that is the insight that is so difficult to have, or that we don't have, that whatever that process is or so, it really is nothing that has anything to do with ourselves. I don't know if that makes sense to any of you. Some of these guys said the point is not only that you can't make it, you couldn't even resist it if it happened. You know, it has these two sides. So is that what we're lacking? To see that there is some process of seeing that, in a very strict sense, has nothing to do with ourselves.
And perhaps this is what Krishnamurti refers to when he talks about death, right? And perhaps we can also come to notions of total freedom, because in the instant of that realization, if we can use that term, it cannot be known, because to know it, there has to be someone who knows it, even to label it as total freedom. But time has ended in that, because time is a conceptual construct as well. So the mind hearing this, as opposed to that which knows it, comprehends it, understands it, and so on, not that there's a mind that comprehends. So the words lead us astray. We'll ask, will it endure, right? Because the whole sense is, you say you've brought a total ending to this. I've had a total insight. Krishnamurti often uses these terms of total ending, total insight, total freedom, and so on. The totality must occurs in this instant, which is an eternity. But the mind hearing this goes, but then what happens next? Because it hasn't experienced it. Not that there's an experience here, but it wonders about what comes after that, or what precedes it, because it's always kind of hedging its bets as to whether that's the right place to be, and is this the desirable state or something like this. But there is nothing after it. You see, so unfortunately language kind of trips us up in the way we talk about it, because total immediately creates the opposite of partial, and so freedom creates the sense of bondage. So every time we open our mouths to say something about this, we are led astray. And I think that's you know, we find ourselves moving in circles repeatedly because the we're always moving away from this to some extent, and that's our process of escape, which can be problematized because then we think, oh, we're escaping from this. We must not escape from this. I must experience it with the totality of my awareness at all times. Otherwise, I'm drifting into states of non-awareness and awareness. I think Krishnamurti is talking about being totally aware all the time. Then what? How can that be? And he talks about the blossoming of thought and blossoming of my suffering. That sounds terrible. What does he mean to have it fully blossom and die? And so on and so forth. And then we're off on our little mental tirade. Perhaps there's a
to have a short break, and then we're about to do the final round of just collecting feedback, how it was for you, this conference. So maybe a 15-minute cup of tea and waking ourselves up. Hi me. Hi me. Hi me. Hi me. Hi me. Yeah, 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 yeah. So we're going to start. So is it possible for everybody to come? Because it's funny, I have these 4 empty chairs there, and I can push the empty chairs to the back, or do you want to come to the front? Nobody's here. It's empty. It's also for the closing circle, maybe nice to have everybody a little bit closer by. So and some can sit here also if they want. Anybody wants to. The sofa has. So, I mean, it's a large group. We have about half an hour just to have a kind of closing circle, closing moment, which what I would like to hear is just how it was for everybody, if they had fun, most of all, I think. If you had fun, if there was anything that stood out for you, if there's anything that you feel could be done better. Good suggestions are always helpful. I mean, our intent is to do this every year. A conference like this, around the same time, just a week before the May gathering. And yeah, it may be also good to say that to remind everybody of the intent, and I noticed that not everybody read what the intent was, and most of you did, but some people didn't. And our intent was really to because we have the May gathering where we really everything is around Krishnamurti's teachings. The speakers talk about topics related to Krishnamurti's teaching. So and that's a fantastic week also for everybody to come. But this week, this particular conference, we wanted to bring also to open, especially also the windows of the center, and to bring in other people thinking not like the people who are really always coming here, or the people who are inside of the Krishnamurti world, or necessarily very familiar with Krishnamurti's world, but who have similar concerns. The concern about the world, the concern about the nature of self, the concern for spirituality, the concern for humanity, I guess. And and also in this particular conference, we also felt, and also we want to apply something rigorous that is not necessarily the same dialogue style that we have in all the other events that we have, because this is one of the events out of the whole year, and we organize about 9 different week-long programs where it's all about Krishnamurti's work. We organize about 6 different weekend programs all about Krishnamurti's work, and we have many day programs. So there's a lot of happening, and this is one event out of all of that where the intent is really to deliberately create a different way of looking at all this, and to bring in people who might disagree. It's more than that, who hopefully disagree, because only if we open ourselves up to views that are different than the people we surround us with normally, we're not learning, and then and that's, I feel, really like a vision for this place, that that this is a place where it's open, interesting, creative, learning, willing to engage with people from all kinds of walks of life, and not a place that's just like a group where people only meet when they have agreed on how to spell the word Krishnamurti or something like that. So So it really speaks for me. So I felt also really important. I was really happy with Patik also that he also felt excited about, especially also about looking more at the academic side, the rigorous intellectual debate, and I'm also really all for that because that's one of an important way of looking at things. So, and because I'm talking, and I can also say maybe to start how I felt it was for me this 3 days. I mean, and maybe to start also, but firstly that I had tremendous fun preparing for this. I mean, because all these topics are very close to my heart, and thinking all this through, reading the articles by the various authors, and of course Anil's book, and Thomas's articles, and Hilary Rodriguez, I looked at his talks online, and the talk online that we have still 10 years ago, which I thought was really funny. Now for Pete, of course, he hasn't published his book. He didn't want to give me a preview yet, but I read Bohm, so I saw that. And of course, with Patik, we have exchanged so much. I mean, like every other week, we had coffee sessions to discuss. So I had enormous fun and felt enormous meaning in just preparing and thinking and working on this. And also, as far as the foundation concerned, the staff from this center who prepared for this, I felt an immense sense of collaboration and spontaneity and enthusiasm for working on this. So I also, you know, it's like not in isolation done. It's really feeling that we're it feels like a very collaborative thing, supportive thing. Yes, and then now about the specific 3 days. Very interesting information, very more interesting than I had anticipated on, because in the preparation I thought, well, I more or less know now everything about all these characters, and that's done. And it's not. I think with every presentation, even Patik, who I think the third time a very similar presentation I've seen. Still I had new things that I thought, oh, hey, really interesting. And Anil, I read his book, but still there were other things. Especially the moment, I don't know, at the end of his talk last time, the last moment, the last 10 minutes where he went into the conceptual self, where I felt really something new and something that I hadn't looked at, a way of looking that I hadn't looked at it before. So I felt really excited about that. And with Thomas, of course, with all the models, and with Hilary, the mapping out K in a very clear way. And also, what I appreciated, what I hadn't anticipated on, is how to bring it into relation with world religions, with the other religions that talk about similar things. Which, of course, I knew it was his speciality, but I hadn't anticipated on that, which I felt was really surprising. Yeah, and Pete for his courage. You know, I felt really to take a view which is, I mean, and I've read Bohm's, all of Bohm's, no, not all of Bohm's books, but at least 4 of Bohm's books, and I found it really dense at the time, and I'm really great that somebody tries to work through all that again, especially the implicate order aspect, which I thought was one of the very difficult books to read. So. What doesn't mean my need, because in a way I feel I have a lot of new information and a lot of different ways to look at, but I almost feel like I need some more days to assimilate it and to start to make it my own, and to be able to come from that position to start putting more questions to you. Now, privately, of course, I can do it, because all the speakers, or most of the speakers, will be here for the rest of the week, so I will have that chance. But I feel if the others like you are also like that, with a lot of new knowledge, and not being able to integrate all the knowledge, that is, so you have to come back next time, I guess, and do and do it that way. So, but that is, yeah, that's where I am. So pretty full. And
can I just pick up on one
yeah,
aspect?
yeah.
With respect to that thing about coming back next year versus we're going to get a chance to talk. I can't speak for everybody, but certainly for myself, that if you have anything to put to me and it's a critique, I want it. If you want to say something nice, I really don't care. Or no, really, I don't, because it's not useful. But if you want to challenge something, I give you my email. We can talk. We can email. You can do that anytime, because no, I honestly mean it. That the only thing I value is critique. You know, among friends, it's nice to hear that, oh, you know, you did well and this felt good. But it's really, at the end of the day, quite useless. Even in our academic life, I'm kind of hard to work with my students and colleagues and so on, because we've just made it a rule that don't open your mouth unless you've got something to critique, to challenge, to say this is nonsense. Then we're interested in hearing it. If you want to say I agree, don't even bother, because what's the point? And no, we operationalize that. It's hard for people to do that, and it's hard to hear that said to them, and it's hard for them to say that. But that's anyway. I just wanted to speak for myself. I just said Jaap was bringing that up, and I can't think of anywhere I'd rather be for these 3 or 4 days, getting to meet some other people and getting to talk. So enormously, I'm very possessive of my time, and very I'm very happy I'm in the situation where I get to decide what to do, and I couldn't think of anything else I'd rather be, or anywhere else I'd rather be. So enormously for me personally, yes.
I like just to add all critique to Patik, all compliments and all good things to me. Because I value good feedback and how your needs are met and things like that, to hear that.
So I want to say something, make a very concrete proposal. So I liked it too. For me, this was a big experiment. You know that I have my doubts. What was that? Staunch Krishnamurti-ites? The most horrible word of the last 3 days. In the old times, we called them ironically K non-disciples. So I was afraid there would be a lot of K non-disciples here, and I've been moved. It was good, but I thought that at least 3 of us have given very long talks and also explained our own ideas. And for future meetings, it's just an idea. Maybe it could have been better if you have some kind of researcher or some academic to just force them to, like, say, give 20 or 30-minute info blocks and leave their own opinion or their own theory out, so that the more general audience can really profit from it. That we could say, I give you, I don't know, the recent theory of evolution, or recent facts about mind wandering, of which I think that could be interesting for K non-disciples, right? And then there could also be a piece of paper with references or so, if people want to follow something up afterwards, so that the whole thing, I don't know, has more quality of not people coming here and telling their own story, but doing an information service and then the exploration. That might be one idea. On the other hand, what you indicated, if you really want people that disagree, if that's honestly what you want, there are of course many people you could invite, and that would make for a very ugly meeting, you know. And
it's not that I it's just that I feel it's more that in order to have a creative spirit, we should not only invite people who completely agree with what Krishnamurti said or what we are thinking. And I don't know where the line is. I mean, I wouldn't invite somebody who's completely hostile to what is happening here. That's meaningless, because I don't want to sit here just fight. But if somebody really is very strong about, okay, Krishnamurti is about no method, no system, but somebody has a very subtle view on something, and I don't know, I can't, then it's more the intent that I feel is important, not the fact of disagreeing, but disagreeing per se should not be a factor of deterrent. That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good. That's all.
Is this on? Yeah. I very much enjoyed the open window idea and having new people here, and I just I loved all the presenters. I got something out of everything everybody said. I have a question that any one of you might address, which is widening this perspective just a little bit. I keep seeing this whole weekend and what we're doing here, as this village in the base of the rumbling volcano, that we're all, humanity is in at this point. And I'm wondering, given that you're talking about and bringing scientific evidence, which is really fascinating, about the self being whatever you want to call it, that's not an entity. I'm thinking that the discovery that the Earth is not the center of the universe was a pretty shocking thing for humanity and changed a lot of things. So the discovery that the self is not even an entity, that I am not the center of the universe, would seem to me even more shocking. And that I'm wondering what your thoughts are about as that consciousness or information begins to be disseminated in the community, how do you see that affecting the human community?
I think I'll pick up on that only because I mentioned something similar in my talk. And so I don't know if this is helpful, but I propose this idea of a paradigm change, the way we think about ourselves and the way we organize ourselves. So as an example, you could take educational systems. The educational systems that we have in the world at the moment are pretty much based on an idea of individuality, what makes an individual, right? So if you now say that now we've got a different way of thinking about that, then we have to take the self out of the equation. It will have, I guess, what will determine what happens next, whether this gives rise to a more coherent and orderly sort of a world, or if it doesn't. Because if it doesn't, if it's a wrong or incoherent way of looking, it perhaps could accelerate a possible downward trajectory that we might be on. But of course, people will even disagree about that. Some people will say that the world is fine as it is. Others will say, look at the terrible state of it. But if this new way of perhaps ordering the mind without recourse to yourself is possible, and if it takes root, and if it's coherent, it could revolutionize so many different things in a way that we can't know just yet. And I often give the example, and some of you would have heard this already these last few days, so I apologize, that when Faraday discovered electricity, he did a talk in London, and people turned up and they watched it all. And at the end, the lady said, it's very nice, Mr. Faraday, but what's the use of it? And apparently, Faraday replied, Madam, what's the use of a baby? And there are different ways of taking that story, but one way I then sort of carry on from there is that he discovered something, and he said, look at this, here it is. He wasn't thinking about washing machines, mobile phones, the internet and computers and satellites and all of that. But that discovery and its application that enabled something. So if it is true that Krishnamurti, for example, would have put something new on the table, and of course there's disagreement about it. There's skepticism, and you've got a tremendous tradition and inertia of the past of skepticism. So that will be with us for a long time. This questioning, is it something radically different or not? And you'll have people who will argue that it's so radically different, and others will say, no, it's just like what the Buddha said, or it's contradictory. But in any case, if you were to put it that he may or may not, but he may have discovered a new order of the human mind, or a new ground for that, then the application will take quite some time. And we cannot tell now the way that is going to unfold. And I hope that gives some kind of an answer to what you posed. But
since you used the word paradigm, sitting here and thinking about Jaap's question, I haven't heard this in a long time, but there used to be a saying, subvert the dominant paradigm, and it just popped into my head. I think that's why I came here, because I feel like in terms of beliefs about the self, I feel constantly bombarded by what seems to me a very outmoded and not useful concept of what the self is. And to the best of my ability, I observe and I think, oh, now look at that. Now, I wonder if that could be like that. But I don't know this. I know a lot of research is going on, but it's very difficult to get very much detail about that research. So to hear all of this, and I have to admit I didn't understand it all, but I came for another view to the one that I feel, whether it's TV, radio, my neighbors, people I interact with every day, it's all variations on the same thing, which is kind of like the self is a thing, probably immortal, whether it's grounded in religious belief or just kind of the common beliefs that people have, even if they're not religious. It all feels like you can't challenge that because it's so threatening to people. So I have nobody, if I have some thought or question about, well, gee, do you think this is like this? I have no one to talk to. And a lot of the research that came out sort of resonated with my own observations, for which I had no other information to say, well, actually, on the cellular level, this could be like this. And I appreciated the comment about not resisting, because I'm constantly hearing, resist this thought, resist that feeling. Oh, don't be angry, that's bad. So resist the anger, resist the fear, resist the negative thoughts. It's like, oh, don't think that, that's a negative thought. It's like, oh, too late, I already did. So it's really helped to give me like an alternative where I can breathe, because I'm not lockstep with the dominant paradigm as far as how most people, as far as I can see, accept that as the way it is. So thank you all for your contributions to that. It's been wonderful.
Well, I wanted to say thanks to the panelists. You've been essentially on for 3 days, and having been a participant in a few conferences myself, I know that being on for 3 days is a lot to ask, so thank you. Also, I wanted to say that I imagined, even though we didn't have this conversation, but I imagined what was happening was that this was a way to pose an inquiry that could be looked at from a variety of different perspectives. And so I think of that, the words I use for that is an inquiry-based transdisciplinary approach to looking at something. And I appreciated that. And I think that I might think of it that way rather than thinking of it as trying to get people that disagree necessarily, which I know is not your intent. But when we can ask a question that's intriguing on a number of different levels and then look into that question from a variety of different lenses, now we get to see and open things in ways that we couldn't by ourselves. And so that's how I imagined that. And I hope that that can be just, how can I say, refined a bit more in future years, to think of the way to pose the question, which is of course the most difficult thing of all. How do we pose the questions? And then what are the lenses that we might want to look at those questions through, which is what I think we were doing, and I appreciate that, and more of that.
"40 years ago this year, the Krishnamurti Adult Center here in Ojai started by Krishnamurti, 1977. And at the time it started, he said, there will be people who will come who know far more about all these subjects than you do. And you must be open to them. So, he said, put the Bible, the Quran, put all the religious books, the original religious books, in the library, so people have an opportunity to refer to those books, and in dialogue or in discussion with you, they will be able to challenge your closely held beliefs and ideas. So I think from the very beginning this center was has been imbued with that mandate, and I think this conference has been a great example. We have moved from what Thomas described as non-followers to Krishnamurti jihadists. And fortunately there are none here this weekend, but maybe they're watching online. But this has been a good example of challenging all of the closely held beliefs and ideas that we all have. So I thank you.
Mark and I were talking earlier, it's going to be a disappointment tomorrow. This has been great. We're going to have to face ourselves and our boredom.
So I don't know, one of you mentioned that, with this kind of knowledge that the self is not an entity, somehow, there might be a big paradigm shift. I can't help feeling that that may not be the right way to think about what might happen or what might not happen, because if you think of our conceptual selves, the idea of what we are, each one of us, we are a complex of ideas that's based on interactions with the people surrounding us, the broader culture, the body, the mind, everything, right? So there are already possibly subcultures and or people whose conceptual selves are far more porous than we know, and so the idea of what the self is, there are many such ideas around, and we are kind of privy to one, possibly a slight variation, but generally I think we all kind of fit into one mold of what the self is or how it feels to us. But I'm pretty sure that there are tribes that feel differently about who they are, and so it's not like we're going somewhere with this. I think this idea of a self is literally competing with other ideas of the self for resources on the planet. And that's something to keep in mind. I don't think, I don't know how else to say it, but it's just a complex of ideas swirling around, and that complex of ideas, each one of us is that. I know, I've met people in a tribe in India who think very differently about the notion of progress, very, very differently. People who haven't changed for 1500 years, not because they're isolated and in complete or in complete lack of contact with urban India. They're just 3 hours walk. We got there by walking 3 hours, so they could have easily walked too. But the minds that inhabit those bodies are somewhat different, substantially different. I wouldn't understand what that feels like, but they're there. And the developmental process that was happening in India at that time was displacing them from their environment. And we all had to write letters to our president saying something about it. And all I could write was, I feel like we're in the presence of a different kind of mind. And we need a diversity of minds to be a planet that survives. And so I don't think we should think of this as some truth that's taking us forward. I think that it's just what it is, recognizing it for what it is, and then that there are people who really do embody different kinds of minds. And I don't know how else to say that, but
okay. Thank you very much, and see you next time.